ale już właśnie tak myślę, że
już jesteśmy online.
Dobra, to idę zapraszać.
Bardzo dziękuję.
I teraz proszę mi jeszcze powiedzieć, czy coś na przystani Pani organizuje? Jakieś nagłośnienie?
Nie, tam już tylko mamy
Rozumiem. Ja wszystko rozumiem, tylko dlatego pytam, czy będziecie tam chcieli jakieś nagłośnienie, mikrofony, żeby coś powiedzieć? Nie wiem, czy... Jasne. Tak byśmy powiedzieli, nagłośnienie, zawieźli po prostu nagłośnienie, tak głośniki. Myśmy zrobili nagłośnienie.
Spokojnie jest.
Dlatego mówię, zapytam, bo coś to będziemy pakować i jeść.
Już tak duże, ja naprawdę to wiedziałam wcześniej, ale tak trudno mi do tych informacji było dojść.
Przecież informatycy i przecież oni wiedzą, że my robimy same. Musi to zająć.
Ostatnio film słyszałam gdzieś tam, ale to było nie pełne tydzień, jeszcze wyjeżdżałam za granicę i jak wróciłam, że teraz zacznę, wtedy przyszłam w to.
Dobrze, bo do nas zadzwoni Kukusz, kierownik, nie jest on.
Tak bardzo zadzwoniłam.
No i on do nas dzwoni, dziennie, bo tam się kobieta męczy, trzeba zbietników uruchomić. No to do nas samochód, żeśmy przyjechali, no tak? Nie? A tu się okazuje, że tu wielka impreza.
Dobrze, idę zobaczyć.
Nie kopać.
Pokazać trochę, że ludzie wchodzą.
O, dwóch widzów nam się dołączyło. Dziękuję. Proszę bardzo. Jest mało.
So welcome everyone to the last panel of today, and as was pointed out, there's only two speakers. It's India, Expectations and Experience, and our first speaker is Professor David Scourfield, whose work I admire. He's a classicist, and I think the only reason we came to this conference is to find out whether it's Turton or Burton, right? And you're gonna tell us, so I'm looking forward to it.
Thank you, Nico. Is this thing, have I got this right? Does that sound okay? Yeah, thank you. Well, it's a great pleasure to be here, and thanks to Christoph and Anna and Elisa and all the organisers for putting it on. It's a great pleasure to be in Poland for the first, but I hope not the last time. Contemplating the coming end of his student life in Cambridge, Ricky Elliott, the central figure of Forster's second published novel, The Longest Journey, expresses his anxiety to his friend Stuart Ansell in a way that we might find surprising. I wish we were labelled. What underlies this wish is the fear of the loss of friendship. So strong, says the narrator, and so fragile. We fly together like straws in an eddy to part in the open stream. Labels, as Ricky goes on to explain to a puzzled Ansell, would allow parted friends to know each other again, a means of recognition in a future in which we may well imagine the natural changes wrought by time make recognition without such a marker of identity difficult. Of all his novels, The Longest Journey is the most overtly and the most deeply informed by Forster's classical education, one of the many ways in which he and Ricky resemble each other. In this context, the metaphor of labelling might fairly remind us of a suggestive ancient Greek metaphor, that of the impress or stamp on a coin applied to a person, a mark of characteristic. And that, indeed, is the mot juste, for the Greek word for the stamp on the coin is character, the ancestor of our English word. Some striking instances may be found in Greek tragedy, and I think it's appropriate to home in on this because The Longest Journey is strongly coloured by this genre in a number of ways. Let me give one example of this usage. In this case, not strictly a metaphor, but just as good, a trope that relies on the pre-existence of the metaphor. In Euripides' tragedy Electra, the eponymous character's brother, Orestes, returns secretly to his ancestral home after many years in exile. While seeking to conceal his identity, he senses himself being recognized by the elderly servant who had smuggled him away out of danger as a boy, and says, "Why does he look at me as if scrutinizing the shining impression, character, on a silver coin?" Now, although Greek coins of the 5th century BC did not bear the image of a person, though they might bear the image of a god, the trope implies that Orestes bears a stamp, in this instance of a physical kind, which identifies him as an individual. It's not always quite like this. More frequently, and more naturally perhaps, the Greek metaphor is used in regard to moral qualities and in classifying a type of person. And our word type, incidentally, as I'm sure many of you are aware, is also derived from a Greek term denoting or connoting the impression of a seal or the stamp on a coin. Euripides again provides an example in the Medea, where the protagonist, abandoned by her husband and now facing exclusion from the city, calls on the god Zeus to ask why he has given people clear signs for recognizing counterfeited gold, when with men there is no stamp, character, set by nature upon the body by which one can distinguish a bad one from a good. Here we might note in passing that as a young man at Cambridge, Forster had written parodies of a work entitled Characters by Aristotle's distinguished pupil Theophrastus, which is precisely a set of pen sketches of different types of person. We might wish at the same time to observe that the idea of a mark to distinguish moral quality is sometimes expressed in terms more general than those of a stamp on metal. The key Greek word here is tekmerion, a sign, a symbol, a proof. Well, when the labelling metaphor recurs 17 years later in a passage to India, it reflects much more closely this second categorizing usage of its Greek precursor, and labelling is not seen as something to be desired. On becoming engaged to the colonial magistrate Ronnie Hislop, suddenly and almost accidentally, after a disconcerting incident on the very day when she's already told him that they are not going to be married, Adela Quested construes what has happened in these terms. She was labelled now. She felt humiliated again, for she deprecated labels. The wording on this label is made clear later in a conversation between Adela and Dr. Aziz prior to their explosive excursion to the Maraba caves. By marrying Mr. Hislop, I shall become what is known as an Anglo-Indian. Aziz held up his hand in protest. Impossible. Take back such a terrible remark. But I shall. It's inevitable. I can't avoid the label. The great events of the novel that followed the incident in the Maraba would seem to underscore the confining, directing power of the label and Adler's inability to avoid the mentality of Anglo-India as she accuses Aziz of improper conduct in one of the caves. There's a second instance of a perception of labelling in this text. Convinced from the start that the charge brought against Aziz rests upon some mistake, and seeing Anglo-India line up against him on the basis of racial assumptions, Cyril Fielding, the least colonial-minded of Chandrapur's British residents, joins the opposite army. You actually are on our side against your own people? Asks the barrister Hamidullah. Yes, definitely, replies Fielding. But then we read, he regretted taking sides. To slink through India unlabelled was his aim. Henceforward he would be called anti-British, seditious, terms that bored him and diminished his utility. For Fielding, as for Adler, becoming labelled in the world of the novel, the India of British rule, is, it seems, the inevitable consequence of particular individual decisions, despite the discomfort that this causes both of them. At this point, I want to turn to a very specific form of labelling, the personal name. Names interested Forster. He uses and even reuses for some of his characters the names of people he knew or had known. Ansel, for instance, not only Ricky's friend in The Longest Journey, but the eponymous object of desire in an early short story, a reflex of a garden boy the young Forster had known at his childhood home, Rook's Nest. There are many instances of the speaking name, sometimes requiring a basic knowledge of etymology to decode. It's not coincidental, for example, that Cecil Vyse in A Room with a View is called Cecil, i.e. blind, a derivation from the Latin caecus, goes about with his nose in a book, fails to see the human life before him. When Lucy Honeychurch breaks off their engagement and tells Cecil what kind of a person he really is, it is, in his own words, a revelation. Lucy, in keeping with her name, shedding light from the Latin lux. In the passage to India, Forster's engagement with personal names is, I'm going to argue, of a rather different kind. It's important to note at the outset that he draws our attention to the topic at an early stage. Misquested. What a name, remarks Mrs. Turton to her husband in chapter 3, shortly after meeting the new arrival. Just a few pages later, Mrs. Moore, also newly arrived and informed of the name of the man she'd recently conversed with at a mosque, exclaims, Aziz, what a charming name. And indeed, in the mosque scene in chapter 2, there's already a notable stress on names. May I know your name? Asks Aziz, and Mrs. Moore tells him. And then, as they disclose some basic facts about themselves in their conversation, they discover that they have something in common. 3 children, 2 sons and a daughter in each case. What are their names? Asks Mrs. Moore. Not also Ronnie, Ralph and Stella, surely? The suggestion, says the narrator, delighted Aziz. No, indeed. How funny it sounds. Their names are quite different and will surprise you. Listen, please. I am about to tell you my children's names. And he does. This striking emphasis encourages us to reflect on the significance of the personal name, a marker of individuation. Ronnie, Ralph and Stella, Ahmed, Karim and Jamila. but by explicitly flagging the difference between the names of his children and those of Mrs. Moore, Aziz also shows how the personal name can equally embody a group identity, a type. In this moment of connection, even intimacy, between the young Indian doctor and the elderly Englishwoman, the sharing of their families as individuals, the essential opposition of the novel is also underlined. This limitation on the defining power of the personal name is also evident in the earlier scene in chapter 2, where Hamidullah and Mahmud Ali debate whether it's possible for them, as Indians, to be friends with an Englishman. According to the Cambridge-educated Hamidullah, it's possible only in England. In India, they all become exactly the same. I give any Englishman 2 years, be he Turton or Burton. It's only the difference of a letter. Turton, of course, is the name of the collector, the chief administrative officer of the district. There is no Burton in the novel, but the phrase Turtons and Burtons, or the Turtons and the Burtons, occurs several times after this first association as shorthand for Anglo-India. Clear out, all you Turtons and Burtons, cries Aziz on his ride with Fielding in the final chapter. So, names may individuate or they may classify, but regarded as labels, they possess an added level of complexity because labels, unlike the stamp on a coin, are easily changeable. We might wonder whether Adela's immediate sense of humiliation upon her engagement to Ronnie might not include an element of despondency, not just at the thought of becoming Anglo-Indian, for which, according to Mrs. Moore, she is much too individual, but at the notion of no longer being Miss Quested, but Mrs. Hislop, her identity consumed by her husband's. Labels need not be permanent, they are unstable. After Aziz is acquitted at his trial, the Nawab Bahadur, who had financed his defence, gives up his British conferred title and becomes plain Mr. Zulfikar, a phrase used twice. But the best illustration is afforded by Mrs. Moore. At their first meeting, Aziz thinks it impossible that she should be the mother of the city magistrate because his name is not Moore, but Hislop. Well, she's of course been married twice. She hasn't always been Mrs. Moore. And in the emotionally turbulent situation which develops in Chandrapur around the trial of Aziz, her identity morphs again when her name is invoked in court and repeated as a chant by people inside and outside who did not know what the syllables meant, and she becomes, as Mrs. Moore, as Mrs. Moore, a figure of religious veneration around whom a cult begins to develop. Names, then, are labels that are labile, defining but not definitive. And this, I think, is significant as being entirely in keeping with an essential thrust of the novel, which is so concerned with issues of identity and of knowledge and control. The chapter in which Adela first rejects and then accepts Ronnie as her husband-to-be, chapter 8, crystallises the problems of naming and labelling in the context of the India Forster depicts. Adela catches sight of a bird. "Do you know what the name of that green bird up above us is?" she asks. Ronnie offers a couple of suggestions. "A bee-eater." "Oh no, Ronnie, it has red bars on its wings." "Parrot?" he hazarded. "Good gracious, no." And then the bird in question dived into the dome of the tree. It was of no importance, yet they would have liked to identify it. It would somehow have solaced their hearts. But nothing in India is identifiable. The mere asking of a question causes it to disappear or to merge in something else. A few pages later, the car in which Adela and Ronnie are being given a spin out of town by the Nawab Bahadur collides with a large, hairy-backed animal. What kind of animal? Too big for a goat. I believe it was a buffalo, unless it was a hyena. Who can tell? And when, shortly afterwards, the engagement occurs, Adela's sense of being labelled is directly contrasted with the indeterminacy of the hairy animal and the green bird. In between his descriptions of the accident on the road and the engagement, Forster offers a different kind of take on this problematic question of identity. After the accident, the Nawab Bahadur's chauffeur, Mr. Harris, a Eurasian, we now call a person of mixed heritage, is instructed to stay and repair the car, while the others return to Chandrapur in another vehicle. Harris is not pleased, his discomfort arising partially from his ambiguous status. When English and Indians were both present, he grew self-conscious because he did not know to whom he belonged. For a little, he was vexed by opposite currents in his blood. Then they blended, and he belonged to no one but himself. Forster's India challenges all definition. The inert mass of rock known as the Maraba Hills is mobile, alive, animate, even human. The assemblage of hills, we read, 10 in all, shifted a little as the train crept past them, as if observing its arrival. The hills are fists and fingers emerging from the soil, a recurrent image. The plain stretches to the knees of the Maraba, and shortly after we're told that the elephant on which Adela is to ride into the hills had knelt, grey and isolated like another hill. The animate here compared with the inanimate. From the elephant's back, Adela sees a thin, dark object reared on end near a watercourse, a snake, or perhaps the withered and twisted stump of a palm tree. No one is sure. How is anything to be pinned down? At the very beginning of the novel, we read that the city of Chandrapur itself, as viewed from the civil station, is a city of gardens, but also no city, but a forest sparsely scattered with huts. Again, Chandrapur trails for a couple of miles along the bank of the Ganges, scarcely distinguishable from the rubbish it deposits so freely. The problems of perception, the theme of illusion and reality, evident here and of course in the central event of the novel, suggest a further link with the longest journey, which is not, I think, often discussed in conjunction with a passage to India. When, after the alleged incident in the cave, Adela is unable to identify which of the caves it was, Ronnie offers reassurance. The caves were notoriously like one another. Indeed, in the future, they were to be numbered in sequence with white paint. Much could be said about this instance of labelling, but I want to emphasise, how it represents an attempt to assert control and order over a world that Forster presents as resistant to order, a world of shadows and echoes and ghosts without form, and in which we can see colonial control beginning to lose its grip. Ronnie's idea can be understood as an almost parodic reflex of the Victorian mania for organisation and systematisation, and more importantly, as a desperate act of imperial self-assertion, both features embodied in the civil lines, the British residential area of Chandrapur, with its arid tidiness, a phrase focalized through Aziz, and its roads named after victorious generals and intersecting at right angles, symbolic of the net Great Britain had thrown over India, a geometry incompatible with the circularities of the Marabar caves. Well, I'd like to end by returning to Mr. Turton, re-Turtoning. In the episode in chapter 2, in which Hamidullah and Mahmud Ali discuss the English, Hamidullah illustrates his view that in India, the English change by referring to how in the past he had driven with Turton in his carriage. Turton! Oh, yes, we were once quite intimate. He has shown me his stamp collection. We must here, I think, envisage an album, perhaps displaying stamps from the various territories of the British Empire, and we might like to recall that A Passage to India was published in the very month that the remarkable British Empire exhibition opened at Wembley, with the image of the King Emperor stamped identically on every one of these labels, in every way suggesting fixity. Or perhaps even stamps from across the whole globe, neatly, we may assume, arrayed on pages arranged alphabetically by country. In either case, the album will symbolically represent the attempt to organize, manage, and contain the world in a literary context which challenges this very possibility and questions the inevitability of divisive categorizations and the power of the label, the name, even language, to define. Thank you.
Thank you, David. What a great talk, and I'm sure we'll have questions later. We're going to move on to Xinyi, who is going to talk about Stranger Beneath the Skin, reading female experience of colonial illness. Fascinating in A Passage to India.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Xinyi, and the title of my presentation, as Dr. Endres has just introduced, is Stranger Beneath the Skin, Reading Female Experience of Colonial Illness in A Passage to India. Recent years have seen a proliferation of studies focusing on the representation of illness in modernist writing. Scholars are interested in how modernist writers consciously deviate from preceding literary treatments of illness. Illness is no longer only a metaphor for some failing or crisis in the larger mechanism of society, or a blank screen devoid of meaning onto which the romantic imagination is projected. Instead, it acquires spatial temporal dimensions and psychological depth. As Peter Fifield argues, the critic whose quotation is on the screen, literary modernism's, quote, intense concentration on interiority, non-normativity, and the varied experiences of the embodied consciousness, unquote, leads it to represent illness as the lived experience of individuals, as opposed to a naturalistic account of physical facts. Meanwhile, contends Fifield, the same critic, its ambiguous, non-linear, and fragmentary narratives frequently, quote unquote, blend interior and exterior, individual and systemic standpoints, enabling modernist writers to situate the ill character in relation to other figures and to the community and the society in which this individual is intricately embedded. Discourses of illness are not merely medical discourses, but, to use Howard Choi's words, always already interdiscursive with broader issues like imperialism, nationalism, social psychological crisis, social disorders, homo/sexuality, or political agenda. A Passage to India, however, has seldom been examined from the perspective of modernist illness studies, perhaps due to the reason that Forster chiefly exploits illness as a symbol or a plot device, like marriage or the mistaking of an umbrella. This situation changes in A Passage to India. Critics such as Homi Bhabha, Banita Pari, and Charu Malik have long noted the narrative uncertainty and the rhetorical ambiguity in the novel's representation of India's otherness, which signifies a departure from the self-confident discourse of colonial authority. Represented in an uncertain and unpredictable way, illness in A Passage to India disrupts the imperial discourse, showing the text's refusal to assimilate otherness and opening up space for potential crossovers. Although what happens in the Maraba caves has long dominated scholarly attention, I argue that it marks but one stage in a prolonged and non-normative psychosomatic condition that characterizes the two women's experience of the Raj, of the colony's social relations and the material environment. Mrs. Moore's and Adela's illness experience, read as a coherent whole, signifies a persistent dis-ease towards the reality of the colonial life, an interlocking pattern of mental and physical strain in the face of an alien and hostile nature on the one hand, and on the other, an overwhelming mood of stagnation and ennui in a society inhibiting and policing cultural and affective exchange. Let us first look at Adela's account of her illness and how it creates a moment of uncertainty and contradiction that the imperial discourse fails to recuperate. After the trial, Adela takes refuge in the government college under the protection of Fielding. There she confesses to Fielding that she has been unwell ever since the expedition to the caves, and possibly before it. And according to her recollection, it is during Fielding's garden house party she first felt out of sorts. So let's look at the quotation. Adela says, "I was not ill. It is far too vague to mention. It is all mixed up with my private affairs. I enjoyed the singing, but just about then, a sort of sadness began that I couldn't detect at the time. No, nothing as solid as sadness. Living at half pressure expresses it best. Half pressure. I remember going on to polo with Mr. Hislop at the Maidan. Various other things happened. It doesn't matter what, but I was under par for all of them. I was certainly in that state when I saw the caves." So in this confession, which often eludes the close examination of scholars focusing on the representation of women and the allegorization of rape in A Passage to India, we find a correlation between an amorphous and ill-defined psychosomatic experience termed illness and Adela's excruciating experience in one of the Maraba caves. There is simultaneously a narrative impulse in the text to deny and obfuscate that correlation. In a similar way as her illness resists clinical definition and control, Adela is struggling to delineate the contour of her experience against an, quote, insidious and tough force, which, to use Spivak's words, in the form of imperialist axiomatics, bottles her up in a narrow niche in its vast scheme of sexual reproduction and social subject production. The text, deliberately ambivalent towards the truthfulness of the alleged rape, sanctions an alternative mode of interpretation and reworks the meaning-making process of a historical reality of which it manages to produce a certain version. The pattern of two interrelated but distinct planes of meaning is fully revealed here. One, the imperial narrative of rape, and the other, a newly affirmed experience that, centrifugally, escapes the denoted boundary of the first discourse and no longer gravitates towards rape as the exemplar of the colonists' racialized sexual anxieties. Now turning to Adela's abstruse characterization of her illness, living at half pressure. This symptom is shared by Mrs. Moore, the construction of whose illness experience I will analyze as the text's gesture of hope in the last part of my presentation. The phrase captures a non-normative status befalling some English colonists in the empire's tropical peripheries that is historically authentic and culturally meaningful, variously characterized elsewhere in the novel as a new feeling, half languor, half excitement, or an embodied sensorial perception that everything seemed cut off at its root and therefore infected with illusion. The symptom corresponds to the definition of a medical term widely used in early Edwardian medicine, tropical neurasthenia. It needs to be noted, however, that the novel abstains from adopting the authoritative tone of the medical discourse. It never denominates the abnormal psychological conditions experienced by Adela and Mrs. Moore. My paper likewise is not an anachronistic diagnosis, forcing a medical term onto a literary text. Rather, I hope to gesture towards another way of reading the text of A Passage to India as an organic corpus, whose contour shifts constantly during its composition, merging and contending with contemporary discourses on the empire, especially medical ones. So unlike malaria or other organic diseases endemic in the tropics, tropical neurasthenia is at the intersection of the physiological and psychological, the medical and the social, from its inception in the early years of the 20th century. It stemmed from the better-known neurasthenia, a medical term introduced in 1868 by the American neurologist George Beard to define a state of nervous exhaustion brought on by the pressures of modern urban life. The varied symptoms included abnormal fatigue, palpitations, chronic indigestion, a lack of concentration, poor memory, and even insanity. Neurasthenia was a distinctively gendered disease. George Savage, Virginia Woolf's family doctor, sees unfulfilled female sexuality as a chief cause of neurasthenia. While men were believed to become neurasthenic from overwork, competition, and economic acquisitiveness, neurasthenia in women was often seen as the result of dissipating their more limited neural vitality in study or excessive socializing. Tropical neurasthenia shares many similarities with neurasthenia in terms of its gendered implications and symptoms, but it cannot be simply understood as neurasthenia in the tropics. The word tropical was indeed applied as a signifier of a sense of locality, but it also indicates a break from the medical model of neurasthenia at home, which is particularly meaningful to my reading of A Passage to India. Tropical neurasthenia was recognized as a distinct medical condition resulting from the failure of white people to acclimatize to the tropics, capturing in medical discourse the tension between the colonial tropics and its white colonists. The danger posed by the alien climate, however, is not the only subject of white anxiety. Before tropical neurasthenia provided a medical term for the physical and mental debilitation experienced by Europeans in the tropics, 19th century colonial medical discourse is littered with terms like Punjab-had, Burmese ennui, and tropical fatigue or inertia, welding together the geographical location of the colony and a mood of imperial ennui and colonial melancholia. There is a strong intertextual connection between A Passage to India's representation of the Indian natural environment, along with its effects on Adela and Mrs. Moore, and the presumed climatic etiology of tropical neurasthenia, an overemphasis on the danger of tropical sunlight to the white physiology. An anxiety about the preservation of the white colonist community in the alien, unwholesome environment of the tropics was always present at the core of imperial enterprises. Despite their supreme position within the colony's social hierarchy, white colonists were regarded as fragile and transient outsiders whose welfare required alert attention to the boundaries between themselves and the environment they inhabited. The intense sunlight in the tropics was deemed an essential trigger of neurasthenic disorders among colonists. In 1905, the American doctor Charles Woodruff proposed that the deteriorating health of the white colonists in the tropics is due to the intense actinic radiation in tropical sunlight. For those unprotected by dark pigmentation, Woodruff claimed, actinic rays penetrated the skin and stimulated nerve tissue, inducing a state of nervous exhaustion, which manifested itself in such symptoms as insomnia, loss of memory, lethargy, irritability, and, in the most extreme cases, insanity and suicide. In his presidential address to the Royal Society of Tropical Medicine and Hygiene in 1913, Major General Sir Havelock Charles addressed the same concern by quoting Woodruff, as can be seen on the screen. A cause of the nervous collapse of the white man on the tropical condition is due to his white skin. Skin was conceived in the imaginary of late colonial tropical medicine as the borderline between the essence of the colonist's body and its hostile surroundings. The unwelcome intrusion of alien forces in the form of the colony's intense sunlight induces severe disorders and threatens the loss of an identity based so much on the Western notion of self-restraint and rationality. And I find here that this point kind of connects to what Dr. Christie has said in the morning session about the sort of obsession with women's skin, because you cannot really get into his head, her brain, to see what she is thinking. this sort of fascination with the skin. Okay, I'll go on with my presentation. So the menace of the song in A Passage to India is ever present. The text presents an Indian song that is intrinsically malicious and sterilely banal, whose intensity gives it an invasive haptic quality. The song was returning to his kingdom with power, but without beauty. That was the sinister feature. The outdoor space people traverse, quote, was clogged with a medium that pressed against their flesh, unquote. If, as the narrator claims, the song was merely a creature like the rest, and so debarred from glory, it is a creature with conscious volition, like the horses and rocks and temples at the end of the novel. It insists on making physical contacts with people. So Aziz's warning here to Adela and Mrs. Moore on the way of their fatal expedition, light-hearted and friendly, thus strikes an ominous note. Put on your topies at once. The early song is highly dangerous for hats. I speak as a doctor. The imperial medical discourse of tropical neurasthenia is internalized by Aziz as an Indian doctor and readily applied to the white ladies under his aegis. So here we have a picture of the design of the topies, and we can see there's a layer of the sort of pith from the Indian plant sola, so that's solar topies, because it was believed at that time that if you don't have this hat, and the tropical sunlight will kind of penetrate your skull and destroy your brain. So you must, white colonists in the tropics have to put on this hat when they go out into the sun. So the novel, refraining from using the term neurasthenic, suggests that both Adela and Mrs. Moore succumb to the presumed vicious effects of the Indian sun. Both women demonstrate identifiable symptoms of tropical neurasthenia. Mrs. Moore, losing her Christian tenderness and no longer her former self, becomes lethargic and irritable, while Adela, not able to rationally figure out her experience in the cave, makes a reckless attempt to run down from the face of a precipice. Read in this light, the depiction of Adela's illness, she had been touched by the sun, acquires a meaning beyond that of a hackneyed literary expression. Choosing to leave out in its published version the scene of the assault in the cave, the text nevertheless stages the violation of Adela on the part of India's natural environment. As Adela lay passive beneath her caregiver's fingers, which developed the shock that had begun in the cave with hundreds of cactus spines in her flesh, the borderline between human and non-human touches, contacts of goodwill and of violence, or even of sheer indifference, starts to give way. The skin as the ultimate boundary between the self and the environment it inhabits becomes untenable. Apart from addressing white anxiety towards the alien and hostile environment of the colony, discourses on tropical neurasthenia also help to articulate an overwhelming mood of imperial ennui, of a profound spiritual exhaustion. Anne Stoller points out the opposition between the etiologies of tropical neurasthenia and neurasthenia at home. In Europe, neurasthenia was believed to result from overstimulation, from excessive entanglement in modern civilization, but tropical neurasthenia was caused by distance from civilization and the European community, and by proximity to the colonized. In the passage to India, stagnation and despair seem to be the inevitable fate for a society which, exiled and cut off from the metropole, becomes self-enclosed and inhibits cultural and affective exchange between its members and the colonized. Both Adela and Mrs. Moore note the monotony and dullness of the life in the Raj, and how the expatriate community, settling a cultural backwater, degenerate morally and culturally compared to their counterparts at home. Adela and Mrs. Moore take different approaches to resist the encroachment of this collective spiritual depletion. Both attempt to go beyond the narrow confines of a life approved by Anglo-Indian conventions. The meaningful exchanges between Mrs. Moore and India's natural environment and its people, that is, her relationship with Aziz, her friendship with Aziz, are frequently described as producing a vitalizing and salubrious effect. Adela, on the other hand, runs the risk of casting a female imperial gaze over the Indian landscape in her wish to see the real India. Discussing the tangent story of a colonial other in White Sargasso Spivak contends that such a story must remain tangent in the novel critiquing imperialism, because to turn the other into a self on a literary level would be a re-inscription of the project of imperialism. which has always already historically refracted what might have been the absolutely other into a domesticated other that consolidates the imperialist self. While Scourfield's failed attempt to construct a third world woman as a signifier is shared by a passage to India, where Indian women occupy one crucial tangential unresolved moment in the novel. Represented as silent, secluded, and beyond imperial epistemology, the Indian ladies attending the bridge party, held by the Turtons in order for Adela to see the real India, resist the narrative impulse to recuperate them as the self-consolidating other for the Western feminist individualist. Adela's endeavor to connect with her colonized counterparts fails, and she sees in front of herself yet another shutter, another wall, which pushes her back to the deadening homogeneity of the Anglo-Indian circle. She tried to make them talk, but she failed. She strove in vain against the echoing walls of their civility. The concluding paragraph of my presentation centers on a paragraph from the manuscript of A Passage to India. Representing the negative experience of discomfort and pain, the text construction of Mrs. Moore's illness suggests a possible way out of the impasse of colonial relation. On her train to the Maraba Caves, Mrs. Moore dozed off and then, so here is a screenshot from the manuscript of A Passage to India edited by Staligras. So here we can see that the words in the bracket, in the square bracket, is those deleted by Forster, and the one between slash and backslash is the one inserted by him. So here, Mrs. Moore awoke with a definite and alarming feeling all over her body. She was ill, or was something greater than herself ill. Heart, nerves, or suppressed gout. The doctors had called such a symptom in England, but here she believed that it was spiritual, that the soul can stray out of its kingdom and be caught. She supposed that everyone else must be ill too or equally prostrated, and tried to call to Miss Quested to comfort her. Needless, of course, so here again it demonstrates Forster's pain in selecting the correct name for his characters. So Edith is Miss Quested, which is Adela, and before that she was called something like Janet or whatever. But so here Adela still ate a guava and gazed out of the window for the dawn. Mrs. Moore recovered control. The sickishness and bad taste in her mouth were some relics of something that she had forgotten, but that had underlined the loneliness of human life. So like Adela, Mrs. Moore grapples with the notion that her illness denies any clear-cut clinical definition, or more radically, that the medical discourses of diagnosis and treatment no longer hold any intrinsic meanings. Her illness, assuming an alien form in the colony, holds out the promise for understanding and connection through a recognition of shared vulnerability. Through a conflation of physical illness and spiritual agony, border crossing becomes possible under a colonial regime decreeing conformity and efficiency. The soul can stray out of its kingdom and be caught. This paragraph is left out in the published version of the novel, but it sheds light on Mrs. Moore's transformation and her death in the published text. Becoming an utter stranger to her son and Adela, Mrs. Moore enacts an alternative narrative of her illness, where individuality is relinquished in order that individual identity can exceed itself and metamorphose into others. A quick link can be made here to The Voyage Out, Virginia Woolf's first novel. The young protagonist, embedded in the patriarchal imperial structure, obtains freedom in her febrile delirium, where her body merges with the colonial landscape of South America. Similarly, after Mrs. Moore's death on the homebound ship, her body was lowered into yet another India, the Indian Ocean. Illness opens up a space for potential crossovers, and modernist novels continue to find subversive meaning in the negative experience of disease. So that's the end of my presentation. Thank you very much for listening.
Well, I am looking forward to questions, and I think we have some time since there's only 2 speakers, so please.
I'm Simon Turner. Thank you both for fascinating presentations. My question is for David or Professor Scourfield. I always struck by how reading early 20th century or earlier texts, how naming functions around formality, right? Where they were using a surname or a first name. But I am wondering, sorry, it's the end of the day and I'm a bit out of it, but I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about Forster in relation to labeling with himself, to maybe vaguely preempt a gesture I make in my own paper, like the way that he shirked the label homosexual, or just when you were talking about sort of how names function as labels, how, you know, Edward Morgan, and yeah, just vaguely if you have any thoughts around not just in his novels, but him himself.
Well, I suppose the most obvious thing about his own name is the association of, or the derivation, the supposed derivation of Forster from Forester, because there's so much pastoral stuff in his work, and in fact that connection is made explicitly, not in relation to Forster, but the connection of Forster and Forester is made by James Joyce in The Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man. It's explicitly there, so that's something we might want to work with. Don't forget that another, I mean, I don't know where, first of all, Simon, I don't know if this is answering your question at all, but his own name, I mean, he was not originally going to be Edward, was he? I mean, that was his, yeah, that was his father's name. I think at the baptism, he was called Edward at baptism. He was going to be called Henry, which wouldn't have suited him at all, in my opinion, but you know, that's just me. And one imagines at the baptism his father getting flustered and the vicar saying, what's the name? Oh, Edward. And so Morgan becomes Edward. I don't really have very much to comment about that, and certainly in relation to his homosexuality and that particular label, I don't think I have anything useful to contribute right now. But I think he is very aware of names right through from a very early stage. Certainly from the Story of a Panic on. I mean, even if that wasn't the first one he wrote, obviously there'd been some juvenilia before that too, student stuff. I mean, Eustace is a speaking name. People have said all sorts of nonsense about that, but I connected with Eustaphilos in Greek, and Eustachius, which means rich in ears of corn, and rich in grapes, which I think is very important there. So he's always aware of it. How far his own sense of his own name fits into that, I don't think I have anything else to add to what I've said already, which is not much.
No, that's fair. It was that kind of interested if you have any thoughts, because this has just popped to mind from your presentation. And yeah, and obviously we can't make any kind of definitive statement on his own name and that complex history behind it, but it jumped to mind, so thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you both for two remarkable papers, which actually both deal with labels, but from different perspectives. We sort of had a quick word in between mouthfuls at lunch. David, I'm wondering if you could unpack a little bit the implications philosophically of Forster's inheritance. On the one hand, it's very nominalist, right? If you think about medieval philosophy, the ways in which naming calls forth being. On the other hand, think about the followers of St. Thomas of Aquinas versus the Neoplatonists, sort of in the late medieval period, right? So names, the word is itself divine versus the essences of things which are unnameable or shifting. You alluded to this quite frequently, right? It's the sort of denotative versus the lability of the connotative. So I'm just wondering, you know, over lunch we were talking about the accidental quality of a name, and I think the earlier question, right, at a baptism. So how does Forster sort of, on the one hand, leverage the name, but also try to get out from under names, labels is the question for you. And then, Monsieur, I was fascinated. Jenny Sharp, you've probably read Allegories of Empire. She talks about thinking about allegoresis as a mode, which in a way allows someone like Forster to write himself out of the problem of names. So I'm wondering, my question for you, Monsieur, is that, because what I found so powerful and interesting about those wacky period images and the utopia and so on and so forth, is that actually it's the words themselves that are toxic. You know, it's the words of the colonial racism that is making these people ill, right? It has nothing to do with the sun. It has nothing to. So I'm just wondering if, you know, I know you are avoiding biological reductionisms as if somehow in your own scholarship to imagine somehow that the Indian body was itself ill. Well, no, colonialism is a very real, powerful system which is killing these people. So I'm just interested about the allegorization of illness. Is that in fact your project? You're not really only doing a discourse archaeology of colonial illness or the Foucauldian institutions which made those illnesses real, but actually you're trying to allegorize or deconstruct the allegories of this kind of poison, which didn't come from physical things, that came from the system itself. So my question to you is just, are you looking at allegory the way Jenny Sharp does as a kind of response to the problem of labels that David mentioned? So just first question, essence versus accidents, David, in your particular case, and then allegory in yours, Monsieur. Thank you.
Well, I didn't really get the sense that anyone was going to bring up Aquinas at this particular conference, and I don't really have an answer, Stuart, to your question. One thing I might have added if I'd had, say, a half hour rather than 20 minutes, was the suppression of names in A Passage to India as well, because there are a couple of instances where he's explicit about the erasure of names. For example, when Fielding mentions Miss Quested at the club after the incident, they're all absolutely shocked because we're told they refer to both of them by periphrases, and it's like a kind of, there are two places where this happens, as though names are so powerful that in this context and this kind of emotional context that follows what happens in the caves, that is not allowed to be nominally expressed, and so there's some shock there. And there's another passage too which interests me, which is before the trial when Adela, it's the moment where she's reflecting on what I think he calls her silly idea. The word silly is in there somewhere. Her silly idea of wanting to see the real India, and she runs through in her mind various scenes that we have seen. For example, with the Bhattacharyas and some other scenes, and she remembers them as people, but they are not named at all. It's as though she herself either does not remember or is choosing to suppress their individuality. I'm not sure what to do with that at this point, but that there is some other play going on in the novel around not naming as well as naming. And I know that doesn't answer your question, but I don't think I can answer your question as you put it.
It does. It just, I mean, what I've learned from experts in the room is how much Forster was conditioned by a certain kind of philosophical Western frame of reference, and essences, which are Neoplatonic, versus accidents, which are nominalist.
Right.
And the interplay philosophical. Again, I don't experts here would probably know what Forster was learning at Cambridge when he was taking that medieval philosophy, but I love how he's trying to do both and, right? And I think your paper did a lovely job of framing the lability of names, but also the elusivity of names, is that, we are who we are, but not by virtue of the names we're given, and the difficulty of the burden of those names. In India, of course, it's the greatest name of all, because it's just a small number of letters, but the letters are supposed to contain this multitude, right? But sorry, Bashir, I should allow you to answer the question.
Thank you very much for that question. I feel like it inspires me a lot, because I didn't really think about the problem of allegory in this chapter, but I am doing sort of comparative literature in my PhD projects, and I feel like allegory is a kind of emergent, important concept in my other chapters. For example, allegory in third world literature, in the age of imperialism.
Right.
But here, my instinct is that in sort of focusing on the lived experience, embodied experience of these women in colonial India, I am sort of reading against this allegorization of illness or rape, or this following Susan Sontag, this metaphorization of illness. Because I feel like this may sound a bit too political, but I feel like, for example, when all those meanings and attention gravitates towards rape in this empty center of this of the text of A Passage to India, we can try to turn a bit away from that. I'm not sure if turn away is a good very apt word, but to kind of turn away from rape or the allegory of rape and focusing on a sort of more prolonged but more neglected experience of these women in India. And also I feel like this ties very nicely back to what you have just remarked about, you think it's not the sun or the environment of the colony that is sort of killing or harming these people, but it's
themselves.
Yeah, I think that's a very accurate point, but still I feel like in my chapter I'm kind of arguing that there's more complexity behind that, because I am focusing on white women. So I feel like it's very interesting to see in A Passage to India, it's both women, they fall ill, but other people, I think in the opening speech in our conference today, there are words a quoted phrase is some dry bureaucrat. Oh, these men, they stay healthy, right? They are to quote Conrad in Heart of Darkness, people without guts. So I feel like it's quite interesting to see that why it is all these female characters falling ill. And I feel like here we are not reading illness as some kind of badge of honor. It's in Sontag's work, you are a sensitive person, so you fall ill. I don't think it's like this. But maybe I am looking at this sort of neglected space, maybe characterized by illness, where these women can sort of try to delineate their experiences and try to find spaces for crossovers and potentials. But these are kind of receded a little bit in my chapter at the current stage. But
well, thank you. Let's have one more question, right, and then we'll close.
Yeah, I just want to start by saying that those were two very engrossing papers, and Stuart asked the best questions in the room, so you really don't know what, whether it's necessary to ask another question. So this is not really a question so much as a comment or an addendum. Your paper spoke about names and labeling, and also the fact that there was this sense of erasure I found very, very fascinating. But a couple of things that I wanted to draw attention to, and I'm going far, far away from Aquinas and beginning right at the bottom of the ladder. I was just talking about how language works across cultures. So this whole sense of Turtons and Burtons, for instance, and of course we know that Burton is not there and you only have Turton. It becomes a way in which all cultures speak orally, so we have Humpty Dumpty, and we have Tweedledum and Tweedledee, and we have Hobson and Jobson, and these are the only three terms that come to mind, but I'm sure everybody could think up so many. Even today when we speak in various languages in India, you're always rhyming, so if you want somebody to come and have tea with you, so you will speak in Hindi, and when we just do a small demo, you'll say chai shy, which is not, are you shy of tea, but will you have tea? So you just make, you stretch the language a little more. Yes. So I was thinking this is also something that Foster brings into his narrative. And I think he does that very well with Mrs. Moore, who translates into S-Miss S-More. And the other thing I wanted to say was, in India, a lot of people in the north are in the habit of pronouncing their S, the S, with the emphasis with the E sound at the beginning. And I think that's what Foster tries to capture. There are still people who say school for school. So, I mean, I just thought this would be a interesting add-on.
I love that point.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, the other thing I wanted to say was, you spoke about the bird whom that they could not name. You spoke about the elephant that turned into a hill. There's also a snake that's a rope, or a twig.
Yes.
And some of these go back to philosophical ideas in the Indian context. So we are talking about illusion and reality. So the standard character looks at a rope or looks at a shadow and thinks it's a snake and hides or stays away, and then in the daylight he can see that it's not a snake but just a rope or a twig or whatever. So I think Foster also very cleverly includes this into the narrative, because he's also grappling with Hinduism. Not just the sublime in the classical context, but also the sublime that Vedanta or Hinduism is talking about. And in this connection, there was one more bright thing I wanted to say. Suddenly slid away. So not naming, this is a space that I was very curious about, because you have on the one hand this colonial space, and what is happening in India at this point from 1860 to 1920, and I'm using these terms I'm using these years as a period very roughly, because I'm not a historian, and the older I grow I find that numbers and figures just slip out of my head. Never had any complex math skills. So this is the period when there is a cataloguing that is being done of the Indian people,
Yeah.
and this has done far more harm to independent India than anything else that the British did before or after. So I find it quite interesting that in the space where everything is being numbered and organized with people, here is Foster and the rest of the British who are there trying to name birds and wondering what their names are. And when they talk about meaning disappearing, it's also the enormity of this country and its people, who can't be so easily catalogued.
Yes, yes. No, exactly. I mean, thank you so much for that. And that comment is really helpful. It's absolutely true. But I think I referred in my paper, not to India specifically, but to the Victorian mania for organising things. And I think in the colonial context, what they do in the colonial context is, I don't want to say a reflex of that, but it's closely involved with, there's a kind of bigger picture there, that it's not just about the colonization, it's about a kind of way of thinking about the world, which probably does stem, I'm guessing, I'm not a historian either, from this attempt to almost to measure the globe in certain ways, because that's what they're doing. So the numeration. I mean, I was looking at an article on this a few days ago about numeration and the importance of numeration in this period. So yeah, I must think about it more, and perhaps we can correspond about that too.
Sure. Would love to do that.
That'd be nice.
I also wanted to respond to your picking up this term tropical neurasthenia, and it's again a very interesting term, but you're looking at medical science which is very faulty, very problematic in terms of the distinctions it makes, in terms of the categorizations it makes, and also in terms of the fact that today you find a lot of the narratives, whether they're talking about homosexuality as a crime or whether they're talking about adultery as a criminal offense. Both of these are part of the same tradition of enlightened discourse that was offered to the entire world. So why are we taking these terms so seriously, and why are we applying them? If we are looking at illness in, let's say, a state that is not embedded with psychology, if we are looking at illness as a natural state, You know, you are in good health, then you can fall ill, you can recover, you can grow old, and you can die. I mean, these are categories of existence, isn't it? So then how do we interpret illness and how it's being presented in the course of the narrative? And who are the really ill women you see in the narrative? The other thing I wanted to suggest was that if it's being said that here, you know, the heat can give you can make you go mad and die. Interestingly, this is as true of the cold, because you can freeze to death. The absence of light, if the excess of heat is something that kills, the absence of light also provides depression, and this is something that has been corroborated by modern medical studies as well. Also, there is this whole space of the family and the kin, okay, which is much stronger in the Indian context than it is, let's say, in the context of the whites who have come, because they're all, you know, solo figures or nuclear families, as is work, people who've been thrown together by the accident of empire rather than anything else. So how would we look at dislocation and disorientation in the context of people who've come to an alien land versus people who are already deeply enmeshed in kinship relationships and ties? I mean, this is just because we are also looking at neurosis as something that is caused by, you know, of course, Jean-Paul Sartre says hell is other people. But hell can also be a place where, you know, all the people are others. No? Okay, that's...
Thank you. Let's have you answer or comment on this, yeah, and then we'll finish.
Yes, thank you so much for the list of suggestions. I feel like they are really helpful for my further research. Because there's a few points I'm not sure where I would start it about responding to that. Maybe about the first question, when you're saying you feel like this medical term is kind of outdated or superannuated, and I'm not sure if you're suggesting that we need to sort of turn away from that or not paying attention to that, because I feel like, I feel like from my perspective, I'm kind of looking at the interaction between the literary text and the medical text of that historical context in which Forster writes his A Passage to India. And I feel like, although he did not really mention that term is kind of in the backstage of his brain when he's writing. And I feel like by juxtaposing both of them, or by reading that term into the text, it can sort of shed light on the experience of women, and what you have said in the very fascinating last point about these women and children following the colonial, those officials into India, and what they are experiencing, and the sort of for example, the children cannot, it was believed that the children cannot be raised in this tropical area, otherwise they are going to, to use the word, degenerate, so they are kind of being sent back to Britain to grow up, and then that causes a lot of depression and agonizing feelings on the part of the mother. So I'm not sure if that answers the question or can be counted as a response, but that's what comes into my mind.
It kind of has to answer because it's 6 o'clock, so let's close. And thank you very much for the wonderful Did you have anything to say about dinner? Or?
Yes, yeah, this is what I'm trying to... Maybe I'll just switch off the transmission and then I say a few words about dinner.